The farm gate creaked when Hannah pushed the old wood with the hand that wasn't holding her small suitcase. The sun was already almost touching the distant hills, and the orange light bathed the dusty yard of a homestead that looked weary, just like the man standing on the porch. Thomas held a baby in his arms who whimpered softly, with that cry of someone too tired to ask for more. And beside him, a girl of about 6 years old watched the stranger with eyes too hard for a child. The kitchen was dark, the wood-burning stove cold, and the smell coming from that house was not of food, but of abandonment. It was then, seeing that strong man brought to his knees by sorrow, that Hannah took a deep breath and spoke the words that would change everyone's destiny. "If you let me stay, I can make dinner." And what seemed like just a phrase from a hungry young woman, my friends, became one of the most beautiful stories these dirt roads have carried on the wind. If you believe that sometimes God puts the right person in our path, just when hope is running out, give me your like now. Subscribe to the Stories from Other Times channel here, activate the bell to not miss any story, and tell me in the comments from which corner of the world you are listening to us. Let's begin. In the rural communities, in other times, stories like these were told between rivers and remote logging trails. The path that cut through that piece of wilderness had no name on maps, because maps didn't bother with places where the world seemed to have forgotten to arrive. It was a wide, red dirt track, pressed between rolling hills covered in dry grass, and at that hour, almost no one could be seen on it. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and the silence was only broken by the mournful cooing of a turtle dove hidden in some bush. Hannah had been walking that path for almost 3 days, stopping at the edges of streams to drink water and sleeping under the trees when night fell. The small leather suitcase bumped against her leg with every step, and inside it was little that the world would consider valuable, but everything Hannah truly possessed: a change of clothes, a bone comb from her mother, and a hardcover notebook, where her mother's neat script recorded recipes that came from afar, from grandmother to daughter, from daughter to granddaughter. Hannah was 22 years old, but she carried in her body and soul the weight of someone who had lived too many lives in too little time. Her father, a trapper by trade and a wanderer by nature, died in a mule fall when she was still a child, leaving behind only debts and the warm nostalgia of a man who spent more time on the trail than at home. Her mother, a washerwoman with chapped hands and a gentle heart, held on for 2 more years, until tuberculosis did what sadness had not accomplished. Hannah was left alone at 16 and was taken in by a great-aunt named Margaret, who lived in a small rented cottage at the back of a boarding house and earned a living with delicate sewing. Aunt Margaret was a stern woman on the outside, but she had a quiet affection that showed in her gestures, and it was she who taught Hannah to transform little into much in a kitchen, to stretch a handful of flour into food for 3 days, to make a beef bone into a broth that could revive even a sick person. Hannah cared for Aunt Margaret for 5 years, watching her slowly fade like a candle burning down without haste. When her aunt's heart finally rested on a March morning, Hannah realized she had no one else in the world. The owner of the cottage appeared before the burial to ask when she would vacate. There was no inheritance, no distant relative, no man waiting. There was only the road and the stubborn hope that somewhere, someone would need a young woman who knew how to work. She gathered what little she had in her suitcase. She placed her mother's recipe notebook among her clothes, as one guards a sacred relic, and left without looking back, because looking back was a luxury that people without a home could not afford. The homestead appeared at the end of that afternoon like a mirage in the middle of nowhere. Hannah almost didn't believe it when she saw the wooden farm gate, the wide dirt yard, the white-walled farmhouse with a tin roof, the corral with a few lean cows, and a chicken run where hens pecked aimlessly. It wasn't a rich place, but it was a place with people, and people meant the possibility of a plate of food and a corner to sleep. She stopped at the edge of the path. She adjusted the braid that the wind had half undone. She shook the dust from her light-colored dress, which was no longer so light after 3 days of walking, and took a deep breath before pushing open the gate. The creak of the wood resonated through the yard and was enough to attract the attention of whoever was there. The first thing Hannah saw was the girl. She was sitting on a low stool near the chicken coop, peeling potatoes with a seriousness that didn't suit any child, for it was the expression of someone who had learned that the world is not a safe place. She had brown hair cut to chin length, a simple dress of worn fabric, and a gaze that measured the stranger from head to toe, without saying anything, without making a sign, without smiling. Hannah was about to open her mouth to speak when she heard the crying. It came from inside the house, a faint baby's cry, a voice already spent from so much weeping. And along with it, the man appeared. Thomas appeared in the doorway, like someone emerging from a battle that has no end. He was tall, with broad shoulders and enormous hands of someone who had worked the land since he could remember. But everything about him screamed exhaustion. His beard hadn't been shaved in days. His crumpled flannel shirt had a milk stain on the shoulder, and his sunken eyes carried that kind of exhaustion that isn't cured by a night's sleep, because it wasn't just his body that was worn out. In his left arm, he held a baby of about 7 or 8 months, wrapped in a blanket that had seen better days, and the child squirmed and whimpered with that restlessness of someone who needs something the father doesn't know how to give. Thomas looked at Hannah with surprise and something akin to distrust, because in those days, a woman alone on the road was something that raised questions. Hannah swallowed her nervousness and spoke with the firmest voice she could, apologizing for the inconvenience and saying that she just wanted a glass of water to continue her journey. Thomas descended the 2 steps of the porch carefully, balancing the baby who wouldn't stop moving, and replied that there was water, but that she would have to come in and help herself because he couldn't let go of the child. Hannah thanked him and walked towards the house, passing the girl who remained seated on the stool, following every step of the stranger with those watchful eyes. When Hannah entered the kitchen, what she saw wrung her heart in a way she knew, because it was the same sad disorder she had seen in Aunt Margaret's house in her last months, when the old woman could no longer keep things tidy. The wood-burning stove was cold with days of accumulated ash. Dirty pots were piled in the stone sink, remnants of dried food stuck to the table. There was no sign of dinner being prepared, no smell of stew on the fire, no bread cooling under a cloth. She looked at the clay pot in the corner, poured herself water, and drank slowly, thinking. Then she looked again at the kitchen, the pots, the dead stove, in the window through which she saw Thomas in the yard, trying to calm the baby without success, while the girl returned to peeling potatoes with mechanical movements. Hannah thought of the road that awaited her outside, of the uncertain towns, of the doors that might open or not, and she thought of that house that needed someone, just as she needed a place. The decision formed before reason could argue. She left the kitchen, went to the porch where Thomas had sat with the baby, and spoke without preamble, without asking permission of her own courage. "Mr. Thomas, I saw that the stove is cold and the children haven't eaten. If you let me stay, I can make dinner, and if you like the dinner, we'll talk about the rest." Thomas looked at that young woman with her undone braid and dusty dress who had appeared out of nowhere, offering food as one offers salvation, and felt a mixture of astonishment and distrust, battling with the exhaustion he could no longer bear. He should have said no. He should have politely thanked her and told the girl to continue her journey. But the baby was crying in his arm. His daughter was out there peeling potatoes alone like a miniature old woman, and it had been 3 days since any of them had eaten a real meal. The shame of admitting he couldn't cope weighed less than the hunger of his children. He nodded his head in a short gesture, and Hannah didn't wait for him to change his mind. She entered the kitchen like someone entering a workplace, rolled up her dress sleeves, and started with the stove. She cleaned the old ash, arranged the firewood that was piled in the corner, and with the skill of someone who had done it all her life, she lit the fire on the first try. As the flames gained strength, she rummaged in the cupboard and found soaking beans that no one had cooked, a piece of bacon, cornmeal, a few eggs, and the potatoes the girl was peeling outside. It wasn't much, but Hannah had learned from her mother that cooking is not a matter of abundance, it's a matter of knowing. In less than an hour, the kitchen of that homestead smelled of real food for the first time in many months. The beans bubbled thickly in the cast-iron pot. The boiled potatoes steamed in a dish, the fried eggs glistened in the black pan, and the aroma spread through the entire house like a living presence that pushed sadness out of every corner. The girl was the first to appear at the kitchen door, drawn by the smell like a wild animal sniffing out food. She stood there, looking at Hannah with that mixture of hunger and distrust that broke the heart. Hannah didn't force conversation. She simply set the table with what she found, placed 3 plates, and served the food in silence, as if she did it every day, as if she had always belonged in that kitchen. Thomas entered with the baby in his arm, stopped at the door, and stood looking at the set table with an expression Hannah couldn't read, but which seemed like pain mixed with something else. He sat down slowly, settled the child on his lap, and looked at the plate as if he couldn't believe it was real. They ate almost without speaking. The girl, whom Hannah would discover was named Lily, ate everything on her plate and kept looking towards the pot with a hunger that wasn't just for food. Hannah served more without asking, and the girl accepted without thanking, but ate every bite with an attention that said more than any words. Thomas ate slowly, chewing carefully, and Hannah realized that he was fighting against something within himself, against an emotion that the men of that time and place didn't allow themselves to show. The baby, who had calmed with the warmth of the kitchen and the smell of food, fell asleep on his father's lap with his mouth slightly open. And when dinner ended and silence settled in that warm kitchen, Thomas looked at Hannah and just said that the small back room was empty and that she could stay that night, that they would talk in the morning. Hannah thanked him with a gesture and collected the dishes. She washed everything in silence while Thomas took the children to their rooms. And when she was alone in the kitchen, she listened to the sounds of the homestead settling down for the night. The distant lowing of the cattle, the wind in the orchard trees, the crackle of the last embers in the stove. Before going to the small room, her eyes stopped on a photograph hanging on the living room wall between a wooden crucifix and a dried sprig of rosemary. It was the portrait of a young woman with bright eyes and dark hair, with a serene smile that seemed to bless the entire house. Hannah looked at that face and felt something strange stir within her chest, a sensation that was neither sadness nor joy, but something she couldn't yet name. She quickly averted her gaze and went to the room, where she lay down on the narrow bed with a thin mattress, and closed her eyes, listening to the breathing of the house around her. That night, for the first time in weeks, no one cried on that homestead, neither the baby, nor the girl, nor the man. And Hannah, who had nowhere to turn that morning, fell asleep, feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, that cold stove had been waiting for her. The sun was still asleep behind the hills when Hannah opened her eyes on that first morning. Her body ached from the journey, but her mind was already awake before the rest, because the mind of a woman who needs to prove her worth doesn't rest well. She got up, put on the same dress she had washed the night before, and hung by the window, and walked barefoot down the dark hallway to the kitchen. Everything was as she had left it, clean and tidy, and the silence of the house was one of those that makes one hear even their own heart beating. Hannah lit the stove in the darkness by practice, by touch, by the instinct that years of cooking had etched into her hands. And when the first flames illuminated the whitewashed walls, she felt she was doing the right thing. She put water to boil, found a handful of roasted coffee in a tin can, ground it in the hand mill, and brewed it slowly, letting the strong aroma take over every corner like a silent invitation. Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway before the coffee was ready, with the baby draped over his arm and the expression of someone who hadn't slept enough, but was already used to it. He stood for a moment, watching Hannah move around the kitchen as if she knew every corner, every pot, every spoon. And something in that scene made him uneasy in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't a bad uneasiness. It was the discomfort of seeing someone occupy a space that had been empty for too long, like when you open a window after months of being closed and the light floods your eyes. Hannah noticed his presence and offered him coffee without ceremony, already preparing a cup of warm milk for the baby, with the care of someone who knows that a small child needs food in just the right measure. Thomas accepted the coffee and sat at the table not knowing what to say, because morning conversation was not a custom he had maintained after Rose left. It was there, over that first morning coffee, that the two sealed the deal without needing many words. Thomas said he had no money for a salary, that the homestead had been producing only the basics since he had been alone, that he barely managed with the cattle and the crops, without having to rush inside constantly for the children. Hannah replied that she didn't ask for a salary, that she asked for a roof, food, and the right to stay as long as she was useful. She said she knew how to cook, wash, sew, tend a garden, and raise children, and that she wasn't afraid of hard work. Thomas remained silent for a while, turning the cup between his thick hands, and then nodded his head in that economical way Hannah would learn to recognize as his way of saying everything without wasting a syllable. Thus the agreement was made, simple as a handshake at the farm gate, and Hannah rolled up her sleeves before the sun had fully risen. The first days were of hard work and cautious silence. Hannah transformed that abandoned kitchen into the heart of the house again. She got up before everyone, lit the fire, prepared coffee with cornbread or corn fritters, fed little Leo with warm oatmeal porridge made just right, and had lunch ready when Thomas returned from the fields, covered in sweat and dust. The house began to smell of people who care. The pots gleamed again on the wall hook. Clothes appeared washed and folded in the chests. The yard was swept. The vegetable garden, which had become overgrown, was newly weeded, and little by little new plants of cabbage, green onions, cilantro, and mint that Hannah planted with seeds she asked from a passing trapper began to sprout there. Thomas observed everything with an astonishment he tried to hide. He would return from the fields and find the house transformed each day, his children clean and fed, dinner steaming on the stove, and he felt such immense gratitude that sometimes it ached in his chest, because gratitude, when mixed with guilt, becomes a knot difficult to untie. The guilt had lived in him since the night Rose fell ill. It had been a fever that arrived without warning. One of those, the country folk, called the bad fever, that carried off strong people in a matter of days. Thomas was in a distant pasture tending a bull that had fallen into a ditch, and when he returned 2 days later, Rose was already burning with fever in bed, her eyes glassy, her body trembling under 3 blankets. He rode all night to town to find the doctor, but by the time they reached the homestead, the fever had already done its damage. Rose lasted 2 more days, delirious, calling for the children, and died on a rainy morning with Thomas's hand gripping hers. Lily was awake when it happened. She was 5 years old and saw everything from the doorway of her room. She saw her father cry for the first time. She saw her mother stop breathing, and from that day on, the girl was never a child again. It was precisely Lily who was the challenge Hannah had not foreseen. The girl didn't scream, didn't throw tantrums, didn't cry. She did something worse. She ignored Hannah as if she didn't exist. When Hannah served her plate, Lily pushed it aside and went to eat dry cornmeal with her hands, because dry cornmeal was what her father gave her before. When Hannah tried to comb the girl's tangled hair, she slipped away without a word and went to hide behind the chicken coop. When Hannah tidied the room, Lily messed everything up again and put things back in the wrong places where they had been before, as if maintaining disorder was keeping her mother alive. It was a silent and fierce resistance, nothing childish about it. And Hannah, who had seen pain in many forms, recognized there the most dangerous pain of all, that of someone who refuses to let anything new in for fear of losing again. Hannah didn't force, didn't insist with the comb, didn't compel her to eat, didn't try to hug when she wasn't wanted. She simply stayed there, constant as the stove lit every morning, present as the smell of food at the right time, and let the girl come in her own time, if she came at all. Meanwhile, she dedicated to little Leo the care the child had needed for months. The baby was thin, irritable, cried a lot at night with colic that kept everyone awake. Hannah realized that Thomas was feeding the child pure cow's milk, too heavy for such a tiny creature's stomach, and changed everything. She began to dilute the milk, to warm it to just the right point, to add a pinch of sugar and a dash of ginger tea, and the colics diminished. In 2 weeks, Leo was sleeping through the night. In a month, he was a different baby, chubby, cheerful, stretching out his little arms when he saw Hannah approach. Thomas saw this and began to soften inside without realizing it. He started coming back from the fields earlier, not because the work had decreased, but because the house had become a place where one wanted to be again. He started talking more during meals. First about things from the farm, then about the children, then about matters that had no utility at all, but that filled the silence with something good. Hannah listened with genuine attention, asked questions about the cattle, about the crops, about the land, and Thomas found himself explaining things with a patience he didn't know he had, almost smiling when she understood quickly. But neither of them touched the subject that floated over the house like a rain cloud that wouldn't fall. Neither of them spoke of Rose. The second week brought the first visit from outside. Old Mr. Campbell, a neighboring rancher of advanced age, appeared one Wednesday afternoon mounted on an old bay horse that had seen better days, just like its owner. He was a respected man in the region, a widower himself, but of an old kind of widowerhood, one of those that becomes a crust around the heart. He had lost his wife more than 15 years ago, and never recovered, living alone in a homestead too large for a single man, with hired hands taking care of everything, while he slowly faded away in a rocking chair, surrounded by cheap whiskey and silence. Old Mr. Campbell loved Thomas like a son he never had, and came from time to time to check if the young man was bearing the weight. That day he found the house different, and the young woman in the kitchen, and his eyebrows rose higher than his hat when he took it off. Thomas explained the situation in a few words, and old Mr. Campbell listened in silence, his gaze wandering between the man, the young woman, and the children, with that expression of someone who has lived long enough to know that life creates complications no one plans. The old man didn't say whether he approved or disapproved. He simply drank the coffee Hannah served. He praised the cornbread with a grunt that was the closest he came to a compliment, and when it was time to leave, he pulled Thomas aside in the yard. What he said was short and direct, that the young woman seemed like good folk, and that the house looked better than he had seen it in months, but that the people in town had already found out, because trappers carried news faster than the wind, and that Mrs. Carmichael, Rose's close friend, who owned the general store in the square, was telling anyone who wanted to hear that Thomas had found himself a woman before completing his wife's mourning period. Thomas felt his blood boil, but old Mr. Campbell raised his hand, asking for calm. and said he wasn't there to judge, that everyone knew the pain they carried and the remedy they needed, but that he should be careful because town gossip could destroy more than a flash flood. That night, after Thomas had gone to bed and the house was dark, Hannah sat on the bed in the back room with her mother's recipe notebook open on her lap. She turned the pages slowly, reading the notes written in pencil in small, slanted handwriting. And each recipe brought with it the ghost of a memory: the orange cake from Sunday afternoons, the rice pudding from the summer solstice festival, the oatmeal porridge her mother made when Hannah was sick. In the middle of the notebook, between the recipe for shortbread cookies and the one for raspberry jam, there was a torn page. The remaining piece of paper showed that it had been ripped out in a hurry, and Hannah ran her finger over the irregular edge with an old sadness. It was the recipe for the birthday cake her mother made for her, a cream cake with raspberry jam that tasted of childhood and belonging. The page had been lost in the move after her mother's death, or perhaps before. Hannah never knew. She only knew that ever since that recipe disappeared, she never celebrated her birthday again, because without that cake, the date was just another empty day. She closed the notebook, put it under her pillow, and put out the lamp. It was then that she heard a noise, tiny footsteps in the hallway, light as a cat's paw. Hannah lay motionless in bed, holding her breath, and heard the steps stop in the kitchen. She waited a moment and got up slowly, walking silently to the door. What she saw squeezed her heart in a way she didn't expect. Lily was standing in front of the kitchen window, barefoot, in a white nightgown, her face pressed against the dark glass, looking out. The girl wasn't crying, wasn't making any sound. She just stood there, looking out at the dirt road that disappeared into the darkness, waiting. Hannah understood without needing an explanation, because there are things understood with the heart, not the head. Lily was waiting for her mother to come back. Every night, while her father slept the heavy sleep of exhaustion, that 6-year-old girl got up and went to the window to wait for her mother to appear on the road, because no one had managed to convince her heart that those who go beneath the earth don't return by the path above. Hannah returned to the room in silence, without the girl noticing, and lay awake in the darkness for a long time, feeling the weight of what she now knew. Caring for that house was not just a matter of a lit stove and washed clothes. It was a matter of healing wounds no one saw, that bled in the dark, that hurt most in those too young to understand what it means to lose forever. The weeks passed with that rhythm of routine that settles in without asking permission, and Thomas's homestead slowly gained a look it hadn't had for a long time. Hannah's vegetable garden was already bearing its first fruits. The yard was always swept. The hens began laying regularly again because they now had food at the right time, and the house smelled of food all day because Hannah was one of those women who cooked as if she were praying, with faith that food heals what medicine cannot reach. Thomas worked better in the field since he didn't need to carry the baby strapped to his back or run inside at every cry. The cattle grew fatter. The crops promised a good harvest, and the 2 hired hands who came to help with the heavy work commented among themselves that the boss was looking like himself again. But if inside the farm gate life was settling down, on the other side the storm was slowly brewing, like those summer rains that darken the sky little by little before suddenly breaking. The gossip reached the town before Hannah had even completed a month at the homestead, and it arrived in the worst way, through the mouth of someone who believed herself the guardian of others' morals, Mrs. Carmichael, widow of the former general store owner, and now owner herself of the business and of all conversations that passed through there, had been a close friend of Rose, godmother of Lily's baptism, and considered herself the guardian of the deceased's memory. She was a woman of noisy faith and selective charity, one of those who prayed the rosary at the church door for all to see, and talked about other people's lives, as if it were a community service. When a trapper who had crossed paths with the young woman on the road commented in the store that he had seen a young woman entering the widower's homestead, Mrs. Carmichael felt she had received a sacred mission. She spent the entire week spreading the news with that tone of false concern that is the favorite disguise of slander, saying that poor Rose had barely grown cold, and her husband had already put another in her place, that the young woman must be one of those who went from homestead to homestead looking for a widower with land, that the children were being raised by a stranger, with no family and no references. The poison spread through the town like an oil stain in water, and when Thomas appeared at the monthly market to sell cheese and buy provisions, he felt the stares before he heard the words. The women whispered behind the stalls. The men averted their faces when he passed, and even the baker, who always saved him fresh bread, pretended he had run out. Thomas was not a man to care about others' tongues. He had thick skin for that sort of thing. But when he returned to the homestead that afternoon and saw Hannah on the porch with Leo in her arms, softly singing a lullaby while the sun gilded her face. He felt for the first time the fear that this situation might end, that the outside pressure could spoil what was working inside. He said nothing to Hannah about the market. He kept the discomfort to himself, in the way men of that time did, pushing worry beneath work, like someone burying a seed and pretending to forget it. But Mrs. Carmichael was not a woman to stay confined to gossip. One Friday afternoon, when the sun was already losing its strength and Hannah had just put the beans to soak for the next day, the sound of a wagon stopped at the farm gate, and 3 women got down with expressions of someone going to a wake. Mrs. Carmichael came first, dressed in black as always, with her rosary around her neck and the Bible under her arm like a shield of war. Behind her came 2 town friends, Agnes and Betty, who served more as an audience than anything else. Thomas was in the fields, and Hannah was alone with the children. When she saw the 3 women cross the yard towards the house, she felt her stomach clench, but she straightened her back and went to meet them on the porch, with the dignity of someone who owed no one anything. Mrs. Carmichael didn't even wait to be invited in. She said she had come to see the children, that as Lily's godmother she had an obligation to look after the godchildren's well-being, and that the people in town were worried about the situation in that house. The words came out coated in honey, but the poison was in every pause. In every glance, Mrs. Carmichael cast towards Hannah's clothes, hanging on the line next to Thomas's shirts, in the way she examined the kitchen, looking for flaws, in the way she picked up Leo from the floor and inspected him as if expecting to find signs of neglect. Hannah remained silent, not because she was a coward, but because she knew that a poor woman without family, fighting with a woman of standing in a small town, was a lost battle before it even began. She let Mrs. Carmichael wander through the house. She let her friends make gestures and grimaces. And when she thought the storm would pass without rain, the lightning struck. Mrs. Carmichael stopped in front of Rose's photograph on the living room wall and turned to Hannah, her eyes moist with an emotion that was half real and half performance. She said that this was Rose's house, that this kitchen was Rose's, that these children were Rose's, and that no passing stranger had the right to occupy the place of a woman who had barely been buried for a few months. Then she looked at Hannah with new, lingering attention and said something that chilled her blood. She said it was curious how Hannah resembled Rose, the same type of hair, the same way of walking, and that perhaps that was why Thomas had accepted her so quickly, because he was looking not for a helper, but for a copy of the dead woman. The friends fell silent, and the air in the living room became heavy as before a storm. Hannah felt the words hit a place she didn't know she had, because until that moment she hadn't noticed the resemblance Mrs. Carmichael pointed out. But now, with Rose's portrait on the wall behind her, and Mrs. Carmichael's venomous gaze in front, doubt settled like a thorn that enters the flesh and breaks inside. Lily appeared in the living room doorway, in the midst of it all, attracted by the strange voices. And when she saw her godmother, she began to cry for the first time since Hannah had arrived. It wasn't a child's cry wanting arms. It was the cry of someone recognizing someone from a time that hurt. And Mrs. Carmichael took the opportunity to take the girl in her arms and cast Hannah a look of silent triumph, as if saying that there was proof that the children needed familiar people and not a stranger. Hannah felt the ground move beneath her feet, but she didn't waver outwardly. She waited for Mrs. Carmichael and her friends to leave. She waved goodbye from the farm gate with a steady hand, and only when the wagon disappeared around the bend in the road did she lean against the wall and let her body slide to the ground, trembling all over. It wasn't anger she felt. It was something worse. It was doubt biting within, asking if Mrs. Carmichael wasn't right, if Thomas didn't see her as a shadow of another, if that place truly was hers, or if she was only warming a borrowed space. When Thomas returned from the fields at the end of the afternoon and found the signs of the visit, the poorly made dinner, and Hannah with red eyes that she tried to hide, he didn't need much explanation to understand what had happened. He remained silent for a long time, eating without tasting. And when Hannah got up to clear the dishes, he spoke without looking at her, his voice low and careful, like someone treading dangerous ground. He said that Mrs. Carmichael didn't run that homestead and that Hannah wasn't going anywhere. Hannah stopped with her back to him, her hands gripping the edge of the sink, and asked without turning around if he wanted her there for herself or because she resembled someone else. The silence that followed was one that weighed tons. Thomas slowly put down his fork, looked at the back of that woman who had saved his house and his children, and felt a confusion in his chest that he couldn't untangle. He said he had never thought about it, that to him Hannah was Hannah and Rose was Rose, and that if there was a resemblance, he hadn't noticed. But the words came out uncertain, and Hannah perceived the hesitation, as if it were a blow. She finished washing the dishes in silence and retired to her room without saying goodnight. And that was the first time the two slept with distance between them, not of meters, but of unresolved matters. The following days were strange and tense, with Hannah working harder than ever, but speaking less than ever, and Thomas circling the house with guilt, not knowing what to apologize for. He found himself looking at Rose's photograph on the wall, and then looking at Hannah in the kitchen, comparing unintentionally, searching for the resemblance Mrs. Carmichael had planted in his head and getting angry with himself for not being able to stop. Hannah noticed his glances and closed herself off even more, and the house that had begun to breathe again started to suffocate once more. Lily, with the sharp intuition that wounded children develop, felt the change in the air and became prickly again, as if Mrs. Carmichael's presence had reopened the wound that had barely begun to heal. The girl stopped eating Hannah's food again. She went back to peeling potatoes alone in the yard. She returned to long silences and hard stares. It was as if the entire house was walking backward, untying knot by knot everything Hannah had woven with such care. It was in this stretched cord atmosphere that the longest night of that homestead arrived. Leo began to cough after dinner, a dry cough that turned into a chest cold and, before midnight, became a fever. Hannah touched the child's forehead and recognized the dangerous heat she had felt many times caring for Aunt Margaret. She prepared herbal tea, made wet compresses, held the child in her arms, trying to lower the temperature with everything she knew, but the fever wouldn't yield. Leo burned like a hot coal, his tiny body shaking with chills, his breath coming out with a wheeze that filled the house with fear. Thomas, seeing his son in that state, felt terror rise up his back like a living thing, because that scene was an exact repetition of what had happened with Rose. The same fever, the same trembling, the same glassy stare. The memory returned in full, cruel, and with it came the panic of someone who already knows how this story can end. Thomas grabbed his hat and said he was going to find the doctor in town, that he wouldn't wait for dawn, that he wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Hannah tried to argue that the road was dark, and that it had rained in the afternoon, that the route would be dangerous, but she saw in his eyes something that admitted no discussion. It was the desperation of a father who had already lost too much and couldn't bear to lose anything more. He saddled the horse in the darkness, mounted without looking back, and disappeared down the road like a shadow swallowed by the night. Hannah was left alone with the two children, the baby burning with fever in her arms and Lily sleeping in her room, oblivious to anything. The house became enormous around her, every shadow seeming larger, every sound from the woods outside seeming like a threat. And Hannah prayed softly as she changed the compresses, asking God not to take anyone else from that house that had already paid more than its share of suffering. It was close to 2 a.m. when the worst happened, not with Leo, who was still feverish but stable in Hannah's arms, but with Lily. The girl woke up to the sound of her brothers crying, left her room, and came to the kitchen, and what she saw shattered her world. She saw Hannah holding the baby who was trembling and whimpering. She saw the wet compresses, she saw the tea on the table, she saw the lamp casting shadows on the wall, and all of that mixed in a 6-year-old girl's head with the night her mother died. Lily's body froze in the kitchen doorway. Her eyes widened enormously, and then came the scream, a high-pitched, torn scream, not of fright, but of pure terror. The terror of someone reliving the worst night of her life and unable to separate past from present. The girl began to tremble from head to toe, slid to the floor, and huddled against the wall, her arms wrapped around her knees, crying in a way that didn't seem like a child's cry, but like the lament of a wounded animal. Hannah felt desperation pressing in on her because she had a sick baby in one arm and a panicking girl on the floor, and she was alone in the middle of the night with no one to help her. But desperation is a luxury a mother cannot afford, and that was exactly what Hannah became in that hour, without realizing it, without planning it, without asking permission. She carefully laid Leo in the cradle, covered the child, and knelt on the floor beside Lily. The girl huddled tighter, shrinking from contact like a cornered animal, and Hannah didn't insist. She stayed there on the floor, sitting beside her, without touching her, without speaking, just present, like a warm wall protecting from the wind, without demanding anything in return, and she began to sing. It was a song her mother used to sing on stormy nights. A simple, repetitive melody that wasn't meant to be beautiful. It was meant to be safe, to be the same every time, to say without words that as long as that music played, nothing bad would happen. Hannah sang for a long time, repeating the same song as if it were a prayer, and little by little, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, Lily's body stopped trembling. The crying diminished, the sobs spaced out, and the girl slowly released her knees that she had been pressing against her chest. At some moment that neither of them could pinpoint, Lily leaned her head on Hannah's shoulder. First she just leaned it, light as a bird landing, and then she let go completely, letting the weight of her small body fall against that woman who smelled of soap and herbal tea. Hannah stopped singing and remained still, feeling the girl's heart beating fast against her arm, and heard when Lily whispered with a voice broken from so much crying, a single word that changed everything between them. Stay. It wasn't a request. It wasn't an order. It was surrender. It was a 6-year-old girl, saying with the only words she could, that she couldn't bear to lose any more people, that she couldn't bear to wait at the window anymore, that if that woman left like her mother had left, she wouldn't survive again. Hannah held the girl tight against her chest and cried silently with her, because there are pains that only pass when one shares them with someone who understands. Dawn found the two of them asleep on the kitchen floor, leaning against the wall, Lily curled up in Hannah's lap like a puppy who had finally found refuge. Leo slept in the cradle next to them, his breathing calmer, his fever visibly lower. This is how Thomas found them when he arrived with the town doctor, almost at sunrise, soaked with rain and mud, his horse exhausted. He stopped at the kitchen door and stood looking at that scene, unable to move, because what he saw was not an employee taking care of children who weren't hers. It was a mother holding his children, as if they were the most precious things in the world. The doctor examined Leo, said it was a throat inflammation, that the fever would subside with the teas and compresses Hannah was already using, that the young woman had acted well, and that the child would be fine in a few days. Thomas thanked the doctor, paid for the visit with cheese and butter because money was short, and when they were alone again, he looked at Hannah with a clarity he hadn't felt since Rose's death. In that moment, kneeling beside the chair where Hannah was now sitting with Lily still asleep in her lap, Thomas understood that the question about the resemblance to Rose was the wrong question. It didn't matter if Hannah resembled Rose or anyone else in the world. What mattered was that she had stayed, that in the darkest hour, when he wasn't there, she had held everything together alone. She had held the house, held the sick baby, held the shattered girl, and that was not the action of someone who resembles someone. It was the action of someone who is someone. He said nothing because he hadn't yet found the right words, but he touched Hannah's hand with the tip of his calloused fingers, and she raised her tired eyes. And what passed between those two gazes was more than any phrase could carry. Something changed in that homestead after that night, and it wasn't something that could be seen with the eyes, but it was felt in the air, as rain is felt before it falls. Thomas awoke differently the next morning, with a firmness in his gaze that Hannah hadn't known, a decision that seemed to have been born during the ride in the dark and matured upon seeing the two women in his life sleeping on the kitchen floor. He drank his coffee in silence. He looked at Lily, who for the first time in weeks sat next to Hannah at the table and ate her cornbread without complaining. He looked at Leo, who was already showing improvement in the cradle with less red cheeks, and then he got up, put on his hat, and said he was going to town to sort some things out. He didn't explain what those things were, and Hannah didn't ask, because she had learned that Thomas was a man who spoke with actions, not promises. What Thomas did that morning, the whole town knew before noon. He went directly to the chapel and sought out Father Michael, a thin man with white hair and gentle eyes, who had known Thomas since childhood and had baptized his two children, celebrated his wedding with Rose, and commended her body to the earth. Thomas sat on the front pew of the empty church and told Father Michael everything with the raw honesty of someone who doesn't know how to embellish things. He told him about Hannah, about the work arrangement, about the children's improvement, about Mrs. Carmichael's visit and the gossip, and he also told him, his voice lower and his hands gripping his hat in his lap, that he felt something for that woman, that he didn't expect to feel again, and that he didn't know if he had the right to feel. Father Michael listened to everything without interrupting, as do men who have learned that listening is more important than advising. And when Thomas finished, the priest remained silent for a while, looking at the altar crucifix before speaking. What Father Michael said was simple, and Thomas carried those words for the rest of his life. He said that mourning is not a prison, and that God did not invent nostalgia to prevent anyone from living. That honoring those who have left is not to wither with them, it is to remain standing, caring for what remains. He said that Rose had been a good wife and a good mother, but that she was with God, and that the children were on earth needing living care and not dead homage. He said that if Hannah was a good woman, and if Thomas felt in his heart what he was saying with his mouth, then he should do things properly, that he should marry her before God and the community, that he should give her the respect of a wife, and not the shame of a woman simply living with him. Thomas left the church with his chest lighter than when he entered, and went to make the second visit of the day. He stopped the wagon in front of Mrs. Carmichael's general store when business was at its peak, with half a dozen people shopping and chatting on the sidewalk. Mrs. Carmichael saw him arrive and straightened up behind the counter, ready for the confrontation she knew was coming. But what Thomas did surprised her. He didn't shout, he didn't accuse, he didn't threaten. He entered the store calmly, took off his hat out of politeness, and spoke in a voice loud enough for everyone inside to hear. He said that Mrs. Carmichael had been Rose's close friend, and that he respected that. But that respect ended where meddling began. He said that Hannah was an honorable woman who had saved his children from hunger and growing up without care, that she had done more for that family in weeks than the whole town had done in a year of his widowhood, because no one, not even Mrs. Carmichael, with all the concern she claimed to have, had shown up to help when he was drowning. The silence in the store was cutting. Mrs. Carmichael opened her mouth to reply, but Thomas continued. He said that he was going to marry Hannah, that Father Michael already knew, and that the marriage banns would be read on Sunday, and that whoever wanted to talk could talk all they wanted, because gossip never stopped decent folk from marrying. He said all this looking Mrs. Carmichael in the eyes with a firmness that admitted no rebuttal, and then he put his hat back on. He bought his goods at the counter, paid exactly, and left. The people in the store looked at each other, not knowing what to say, and Mrs. Carmichael, for the first time in years, was left without a response. Not because she lacked words, but because in the depths of that chest, covered with rosaries and judgment, something recognized that Thomas was right. She had not appeared to help. None of them had, and sometimes the truth hurts more than any offense. Thomas returned to the homestead in the early afternoon and found Hannah in the vegetable garden, on her knees in the dirt, weeding among the cabbage plants with Leo sitting on a blanket beside her, and Lily for the first time playing near her, not with her, but near, which was already an enormous conquest. He got down from the wagon, walked to the garden, and stood watching that scene for a moment, engraving it in his memory, because he knew he was about to change everything and wanted to remember what it was like before it changed. Hannah looked up and saw something different on his face, a lightness she hadn't known, and she waited without getting up, her hands dirty with earth and her heart racing without knowing why. Thomas knelt in front of her, right there in the garden, among the cabbage and green onion plants, with the smell of wet earth rising around them, and spoke in the only way he knew how, without embellishments, without a speech, without kneeling on the ground like in the novels he had never read. He said he had gone to town to talk to Father Michael, and that he wanted to marry her if she accepted. He said he couldn't promise the world because his world was small. It was just that homestead, those cattle, those children, but that he shared all of it with an open heart. He said he knew she had arrived there asking only for dinner and a roof, and that he was incapable of offering beautiful words, but that he could offer a name, a real home, and the certainty that she would never again need to sleep without knowing where she would wake up. Hannah looked at him with her eyes full of tears and her mouth trembling, and for a long moment she said nothing, because the words were all piled up in her throat, unable to come out in order. Then she asked, her voice breaking, if he wanted to marry her, Hannah, and not the memory of someone else. Thomas understood the weight of that question and held her face between his large hands that still had dust from the road. He looked into her brown eyes, which were not like roses, for roses were bright, and her nose, which was not the same, for roses was delicate, and her mouth, which was not the same, for roses was smaller. And he said that he was looking at her, only her, that it was Hannah who had lit the stove in his house again. It was Hannah who had taught his son to sleep. It was Hannah who had held his daughter on the kitchen floor when her world was falling apart, and that it was with Hannah that he wanted to grow old on that porch. She said yes without saying the word, because the yes came out as both tears and laughter. And Lily, who was close enough to hear everything, watched from a distance with that seriousness that was her trademark. Hannah looked at the girl and extended her hand, dirty with earth, without forcing, without pulling, just offering, as she had done from the first day. Lily stood still for an instant that seemed to last all the time in the world, and then she walked slowly, step by step, and took Hannah's hand, her small fingers squeezing tightly. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Thomas looked at their two intertwined hands and knew that this was the blessing that was missing, more important than the father's, more important than the whole town's. The wedding was set for 3 weeks later. Enough time for the marriage banns and for Hannah to sew a decent dress with fabric Thomas bought in town. Father Michael read the banns on the following 2 Sundays, and no one came forward to object. Although Hannah was sure that Mrs. Carmichael would be in the front row to raise an objection, Mrs. Carmichael did not appear at church on either Sunday, and Hannah later learned, from old Mr. Campbell, that the store owner had been silent since the day Thomas spoke to her, and that some of the neighbors had started to change their tune, saying that, after all, the widower was right, and that no one had gone to help when he needed it. People are like that, my friends. They turn wherever the wind changes. And sometimes it's enough for one person to speak the truth aloud for the castle of gossip to crumble entirely. The wedding day dawned with that clean September sky that only the wilderness knows. A blue so beautiful it hurt, with a warm wind that brought the scent of lilacs from the garden. The ceremony would be simple in the small town chapel with few guests. Old Mr. Campbell would be the best man for Thomas, and the wife of the homestead's oldest hired hand would be Hannah's matron of honor, because she had no family to fill that role. Hannah got ready in the small back room that would soon no longer be just hers. She put on her new raw cotton dress with delicate lace around the neck that she herself had embroidered at night after the children were asleep. She braided her hair with lilac blossoms that Lily had cut in the garden, and it was precisely that detail that made Hannah cry before the ceremony. The flowers had appeared on her bed early in the morning, without a note, without an explanation. But Hannah knew it had been Lily, because no one else woke up before the sun in that house. In the church, Thomas waited in the suit that only came out of the chest on special occasions, the same one he had worn to marry Rose, and he didn't hide it or apologize for it. Because for Thomas, wearing that suit was not repeating the past. It was demonstrating that life continues on the same foundations and that it takes nothing away from anyone. When Hannah entered the chapel holding a bouquet of wildflowers with Lily walking beside her, advancing with her head held high, because she had no father to give her arm, but she had the dignity to walk alone, Thomas felt his eyes burn and was not ashamed. Father Michael celebrated the ceremony with words that spoke of starting anew and of courage, of hands that reach out in the darkness and find other hands. And when he declared them husband and wife, Lily, sitting on the first pew with Leo in her lap, did something no one in that church expected. She smiled, a small, almost invisible smile, but it was that girl's first smile in over a year, and whoever saw it felt that something was happening there that went beyond a wedding. It was a family being mended with new thread on old cloth. The celebration was at the homestead with the table set in the yard under the shade of the large tree, simple and abundant food that Hannah had prepared in the previous days with the help of neighbors who had finally accepted the situation. There was festive rice, chicken in sauce, hearty stew, sweet bread, maple tarts, and freshly brewed coffee. The few guests ate and chatted until the sun set, and when they left, the homestead was left in that good silence of a house filled with peace. Hannah was collecting the dishes in the yard when she felt someone tugging at the hem of her dress. She looked down and saw Lily with a folded paper in her hand, extending it to her with that solemnity children have when they do something they consider very important. Hannah knelt down and took the paper. She unfolded it slowly, and what she found made her legs feel weak. It was a recipe written in a round, unsure hand of a child still learning, full of errors and ink smudges, but perfectly legible. Cream cake with raspberry jam. Hannah looked at Lily, not understanding, her heart beating so fast it seemed to want to escape her chest. And the girl explained in that hurried way children have when they have a lot to say, and little practice in saying it. She recounted that she had seen Hannah looking at the recipe notebook many nights, running her finger over that torn page, and that one day she asked Mrs. Carmichael at the store if she knew the recipe for cream cake with raspberry jam because Mrs. Carmichael had an old recipe notebook that belonged to her mother. Mrs. Carmichael, whom no one expected to help with anything, looked in the notebook. She found a similar recipe and dictated it to Lily to copy one afternoon when the girl went to town with Thomas. The girl had kept the paper under her pillow for days, waiting for the right moment, and decided that the wedding was the moment, because a wedding is a day for gifts, and that was the gift she wanted to give. Hannah held that paper as one holds a sacred relic, and tears fell without asking permission, thick and hot, wetting her new dress and the recipe, and Lily's hands, which she squeezed between her own. It wasn't just a recipe, my friends. It was the missing bridge. It was the girl saying that she accepted Hannah, not as a substitute for her mother, but as someone new to love. It was the page that was missing in the notebook and in life, and it was Mrs. Carmichael there in town, with all her flaws and all her sharp tongue, showing that beneath the judgment, sometimes there is a heart that knows how to do the right thing when a child asks for it. Thomas found the two of them embracing in the yard, Hannah on her knees holding Lily against her chest, both crying and laughing, and he knelt beside them and enveloped them in an embrace that also included Leo sleeping in the hammock and the memory of Rose, who didn't need to be forgotten for life to go on. The months that followed the wedding were of learning and strengthening bonds. Hannah stopped being the young woman who helped and became the true mistress of the house, the one who decided the menu, who managed the pantry, who negotiated fabric prices at the store, who advised on where to plant and when to harvest. Thomas discovered that sharing decisions was not weakness. It was intelligence, because Hannah had a practical sense that he admired and a courage to take risks that he alone would not have had. The homestead grew in those months, as it hadn't grown in years. They bought more hens, expanded the garden, sold cheese at the market with profits that allowed them to repair the roof and replace the old windows with glass panes that let the morning sun in. Leo grew up strong and healthy. He became a clever boy who ran after the chickens and called Hannah Mom with the naturalness of someone who had never known another. Lily slowly opened up like a flower that needs time and patience, and little by little she stopped being the old child who peeled potatoes in silence to become a child again, playing in the garden, inventing stories, laughing at silly things. And one full moon night, Hannah realized that Lily no longer went to the kitchen window to wait for her mother to return. The girl slept through the entire night, peacefully. And that was the greatest victory Hannah achieved in that house, greater than any harvest or repair. Old Mr. Campbell, the neighbor who lived alone brooding over his own widowerhood, began to frequent the homestead more regularly after the wedding. He came for Sunday lunch, which Hannah prepared with festive care, and stayed all afternoon on the porch chatting with Thomas and playing with the children in a clumsy way of someone who has no practice but has the desire. Hannah noticed that the old man was changing, that the company of a living family was thawing something within him that solitude had hardened. On one of those Sundays, old Mr. Campbell confessed to Thomas, his voice thick with whiskey and emotion, that he had been wrong to lock himself in mourning for so many years, that his wife would not have wanted to see him rot alone in a house too large, and that seeing Thomas have the courage to start anew had been a slap and a lesson at the same time. Thomas said nothing. He simply refilled the old man's glass again, because in the country there are things that are better said in shared silence than in any speech. A year and a half after the wedding, on a summer afternoon when the heat made the air shimmer over the land, Hannah called Thomas to sit on the porch and told him, her hands trembling in her lap, that she was expecting a child. Thomas remained still for an instant, with the empty expression of someone receiving news, too big for his face to grasp. And then he smiled in a way Hannah had never seen him smile before. A smile that was whole, without shadow, without reservation, without any ghost behind it. He hugged her right there on the porch with the strength of someone embracing proof that life had not given up on him. And Hannah nodded in the embrace of those arms, that the question about resembling Rose had died once and for all, buried by everything they had built together. The child was born the following spring, a boy they named Ethan, in honor of Hannah's father, Joseph, the trapper, whom the road had taken too soon, but whom she never forgot. Mrs. Carmichael sent a gift of hand-knitted baby clothes with a short note that simply said, "For the child, with wishes for health." And Hannah kept that note along with the recipe Lily had copied, because they were proof that people can change when time and truth do their work. Years passed, with the haste that years have when life is truly lived. Leo grew up and became a hard-working young man who helped his father in the fields with Thomas's same silent dedication. Lily became a beautiful and studious young woman who learned to read with Father Michael and then taught the neighborhood children under the big tree in the yard because the town had no school, and she decided she would do it. Ethan, the youngest, grew up hearing that he had two special guardians in the sky, Grandpa Joseph, the trapper, and Aunt Rose watching over the stars, and he never felt that this mended family was any less a family than any other. The homestead prospered, becoming the largest in the region, with good pasture, fat cattle, a garden that yielded fruit all year, and a large house with open windows where there were always people at the table and food on the stove. Old Mr. Campbell spent his last years frequenting that house as if he were a borrowed grandfather, and when he died of old age one winter night, it was Thomas who took care of the burial and Hannah who cooked for the wake. Because true family is not just blood. A long time later, when Thomas's hair had turned completely white and Hannah's hands already bore the marks of a lifetime of work, the two sat on the same porch where everything had been decided. The sun set behind the hills, painting the sky with that orange that only the wilderness knows. And the homestead around them was alive, with the sound of grandchildren running in the yard and the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. Lily, who was now a grown woman with her own family, had come to visit with her children. Leo was in the corral with his father, showing his eldest son how to milk a cow. Ethan sent letters from the city where he had gone to study, and in each letter came a piece of nostalgia and the promise to return. Hannah looked at all of it, The house she had found dead and helped resurrect, the garden she had planted, the vegetable patch that had grown, and felt a peace so profound it hurt with its beauty. Thomas took her hand as he did every afternoon on that porch, intertwining his calloused fingers with hers, and asked if she remembered the day she arrived. Hannah smiled and said she remembered everything: the cold stove, the crying baby, the serious girl in the yard, and the immense fear she felt that they would send her back in the morning. Thomas shook his head slowly and said that his fear that day was different. It was the fear of accepting help, of admitting he couldn't do it alone, of letting someone into a house he had locked up with his pain. Hannah rested her head on his shoulder and softly murmured the phrase she had said so many years ago: "If you let me stay, I can make dinner." Thomas chuckled with that low, husky laugh of an old man who has cried all he had to cry and now only knows how to laugh. He replied that she had done much more than dinner, that she had made the whole house, the whole family, the whole life. And Hannah squeezed his hand and said that she hadn't done it alone, that he had left the farm gate open that afternoon, and that sometimes that's all God asks of us. Not great feats, not miracles, just that we open the gate when someone needs to enter. And so ends this story, my friends, which is not about love at first sight, not about passion that is born in a flash and dies in a storm. It is about love that is built by the stove lit before dawn, in the hand that holds a child on a feverish night, in the plate set at the exact time, in the silence that says more than a speech. Thomas and Hannah, what does the name matter? Because this story happens every time someone has the courage to extend a hand, and someone has the courage to accept it. If this story touched your heart as it touched mine in telling it, give me your like now. Subscribe to the Stories from Other Times channel here. Activate the bell and share it with someone who needs to hear that starting anew is not weakness, it is the bravest thing there is. Tell me in the comments what moment squeezed your chest the most. Was it Lily's scream on the kitchen floor? Was it the marriage proposal in the garden? Or was it that folded paper with the recipe the girl kept under her pillow? I want to know what stayed in your heart. And always remember, sometimes you think you're just asking for a plate of food, but God knows what you really need is a home. Until the next story, stay with God, and may He bless your home, just as He blessed Thomas and Hannah's.